Well, that's both difficult questions. I think there are two main points I would make. The first is patience, I suppose. Certainly, as an arbitrator, you learn, I think, that patience is very, very important. So to listen carefully to the arguments and perhaps to realize that a point that you had perhaps at the beginning thought was not a good point, turns out in fact to be a very good point. So patience in terms of listening and balancing the arguments that you hear. The second point, certainly based on my experience as a barrister, is the importance of advocacy. Good advocacy is very, very rare. In terms of focus, you will get barristers, counsel, not only English barristers, but foreign lawyers who tend to ramble and therefore lose sight of the most important points. And advocacy, therefore, is very, very important to focus on what are really important points from your argument. So I think those are the 2 points that I would emphasize: patience and ability to listen, and the importance of advocacy. Much too much advocacy, both written and oral, is far too long and rambling and lacking in focus. And I've often said, when not sure I speak to younger people, is if it is long, it is wrong. The best advocate is an advocate who hones the argument right down to its simplest and barest form, getting rid of what are the irrelevancies. So that's what I would say in answer to that question. Well, I think the main area, and this isn't really particularly controversial, is in relation to disclosure of documents, I think. There's a lot of work going on in this. There are a number of English authorities dealing with that and predictive coding. I'm not an expert in relation to how that is done, but there are numerous companies that specialize in that. Disclosure of documents in the course of an international arbitration usually represents one of the very big costs of a case. And anything that can be done to reduce those costs and for that exercise to be carried out in a more efficient way and cost-effective way is to be applauded. So I think that is the main area in which legal tech will help. Far, far ahead in the future, I suppose a question may arise as to whether legal tech may help in determining disputes. That may be far in the future. That may be in the future. But I think, so far as I'm concerned, that is very, very far in the future. And I'm not sure that will be achieved in my lifetime, but maybe, as I say, far into the future. Well, what's quite interesting about my practice, spreading over nearly 40 years, is that it constantly shifts in accordance with economic events. So in the early part of my career, I spent, 2-3 years working on events in the Shatt al Arab when that was under an embargo and ships were stuck there. Then I was involved in Lloyd's insurance and the problems relating to that in the late 80s and early 90s in what was called the LMX spiral. So my practice almost follows economic events. In recent times, certainly over the last few years, I've got involved in things like satellite insurance. mobile telephones, hydroelectricity projects of that kind, all reflecting economic development and events in recent years. And most recently, of course, Ukraine. I have a number of cases specifically involving ships that have been stuck in or around the sea and in ports in Ukraine, and various arguments arise in relation to that, including, for example, whether charter parties have been frustrated, or there are specific clauses in charter parties dealing with that. And so there are those kind of events arise out of either political or economic changes. Well, in my lifetime, there has been dramatic changes in the way that arbitration is conducted. So, for example, when I started off, you had no witness statements at all, either in an arbitration or in court. You used to go to the arbitration or in court, it doesn't really matter, the same applied. Not only would you have had no witness statements in advance of the hearing, you would not necessarily know who the witnesses are, who would be called on the other side. If you knew counsel on the other side and you were friendly with them, you would sometimes phone them up the night before or a few days before perhaps and ask them whether they might tell you who was going to come along to the arbitration to give evidence, and perhaps there might be an exchange. They would tell you if you told them. That's a good example. That might be described as an arbitration by ambush in a way. You wouldn't know what, not only, as I say, you wouldn't know who would be called, you wouldn't know what they might say. You'd have the pleadings, but often they would be very, very short indeed. You'd have no skeleton arguments in those days. You would have simply the pleadings, which would be very, very short. There would be experts' reports, obviously, if experts were being called, but that was something rather different. Nowadays, everything is rather different. Now it is much, much more institutionalized, either the ICC or the LCIA or SIAC in Singapore. You will have not necessarily pleadings, which were often very short. You will now have lengthy, different words to describe them, but I call them memorials. Usually it started off in America, in the USA. You would have written memorials. Each party would serve not pleadings, but memorials attached to those documents would be detailed witness statements and experts' reports. You would know much greater detail in advance of the hearing what each party's case was and what witnesses would be called. You would have much greater case management now, where timetables are set, and timetables set for the hearing with periods of time allocated specifically in advance for witnesses to give their evidence, to be cross-examined and then re-examined. And at the end of the case, of course, in the old days, you would, if you had, say, a 3, 4, 5-day case, you would finish the evidence and you might stop for an hour or two, or perhaps overnight, and go straight into final oral submissions immediately. So the whole arbitration would be finished in a much shorter period of time. Whereas now, in a case that might last a week, you will often adjourn for a period of time, sometimes weeks, preferably not. Sometimes I prefer much shorter, where the parties exchange written submissions and then supplementary responsive submissions, and then perhaps reply submissions again. And then the award would take a much, much longer time. And you would sometimes get hundreds of pages of written submissions. Often there's a discussion as to whether to limit those submissions perhaps to a certain number of pages, 50 pages or whatever. But that is quite different from my experience as a 30, 40 years ago, when you would go straight into final oral submissions. There's a great debate, of course, as to which system is better. My own strong view is that in any hearing certainly lasting less than a week, there's no reason why you should not go straight into oral final submissions, or at least final submissions within a very short period in time. In my view, this promotes focus of argument, which is beneficial to everyone, not only the parties, but also the tribunal, in terms of focusing, as I say, on the important issues. And it also, of course, is important so far as costs are concerned. It reduces the total, the costs on both sides. So I'm very much in favor of that. And sometimes, of course, that's impossible or difficult for whatever reason, and arbitration have to tailor each case properly. But in broad principle, I, as an arbitrator, much prefer the old style, but somewhat reluctantly, as far as I'm concerned, the parties often agree otherwise. So there have been, I think, monumental changes in the way that arbitration is conducted, and the changes in my lifetime over the last 30, 40 years. That's rather difficult. My own, probably the most difficult of all the questions so far. My own view is that the best arbitrators are the arbitrators who have spent years, perhaps, as barristers or lawyers, not only English barristers, but lawyers representing their clients as counsel. And by being counsel, I think you learn in the best possible way how to present your case, obviously, and therefore when you jump over and then become an arbitrator, that experience, I think, is probably puts you in the best possible position to filter out the good arguments from the bad and arrive at what one hopes at the very end is a fair and just award. So my strong recommendation always is, if you want to be a great arbitrator, you've got to start off being a great advocate. And it's the movement from advocate to arbitrator that I think creates the best arbitrators. So that's my view.